Here at the end of the summer of 2020, one issue has been on my mind lately, and that is how shamanic practitioners can actively participate in creating the kind of change needed in our culture and society right now. A number of people I know are attending rallies and protests, and that's part of it, I think. However, as shamanic practitioners, it seems to me that we have a certain set of tools and practices that we should be able to bring to the table for perhaps a different level of change. Or is it that there is actually no appropriate place in shamanism for activism? Some time ago, I came across Lenore Norgard. She is a shamanic practitioner in Seattle who is also a longtime activist. I recently reached out to Lenore to help me with the conundrum, and this is the record of that discussion, which, as it turned out, took place on September 11th, 2020. All right, welcome everyone. I would like to introduce you to the notion of shamanic activism with a woman that I have been following around on Facebook and other places for quite a while. I've been very interested and curious about her take on social activism and shamanic activism, and I'm thrilled to have Lenore Norgard to join me this afternoon. Let me just read a little bit about who she is in case you don't know. Lenore's activism began in high school in Iowa with feminism and the anti-war movement. She has experience as a journalist, including work on the World News Desk of Reuters News Agency in Hong Kong. Then in 1987, she shares that she had a visitation from an animal spirit, which led to a shift from a paradigm of social revolution to one of social healing. That led to her work with shamanic teachers such as Michael Harner, Sandra Ingerman, and other teachers from the Foundation for Shamanic Studies. So while she studied briefly with other indigenous teachers, Lenore considers core shamanism as the foundation of her practice today. First of all, is that accurate? Is there something you'd like to add to that?
No, that's definitely accurate. Yeah.
Okay, very good. I hate to get it wrong whenever I talk about people's history. So let's just kind of start with a basic question. What is activism? Shamanic or spiritual or otherwise? What is activism in your view?
I think I define activism as any action that people take to try to influence things.
Okay, so it could be basically, sorry.
So if we're talking about social activism, for example, then I would mean any action people would take to try to influence the social fabric or social reality.
Okay, very good. And I suppose that also would go toward things like what people do, not necessarily on a national or global scale, but things that come right to home, like the neighborhood and the community and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. I think activism can range anywhere from conversations within one's family or circle of friends to impacting our local communities. It could be the schools, the school board. It could be, what's being taught in the schools. So that's like very immediate and local, to global activism, like the Occupy movement, or currently the Black Lives Matter movement has achieved a global phenomenon, a global status, as has the climate activism. Environmental activism movements are very much achieved a global focus.
Okay, and it seems to me that activism in that way actually begins locally. It seems like it begins and then grows from personal to family to that sort of thing. Is that kind of the way the evolution seems to go?
I think it really is very individual. I know that for me, Um, you know, my first probably what I could call social and political awarenesses were around sex as a child, you know, noticing discrepancies in how my brother was raised and how I was raised. Um, so having a nascent feminist consciousness, you know, from pretty early childhood. And then in terms of the wide world, I'd say my first awareness was civil rights and then the Vietnam War. So, you know, the Vietnam War was very not local, you know, but had a huge impact on local. You know, I knew people who were drafted. I knew people who were draft resistors. So I think it could go in any direction. You know, I
Okay.
mean, if, for example, if you are living in a country that's being bombed by the US or some other aggressor, it's local, because people you know have been killed, or you know, or you're injured, or you've lost your family, or under constant threat of that. But you're immediately connected with who that aggressor is, which could be on the other side of the world. So,
Mm-hmm. And a thought comes to mind with your experience. I don't know how to ask this question, so I'm just going to lay it out there. What from your experience do you think that we are doing right in terms of activism, and what we're not doing right in terms of activism? And again, the bigger picture of activism.
yeah, I think I might reframe it as to what's working and what's not working.
Very good.
You know, at the moment when I had that insight in 1987, you know, there had always been groups, religious groups involved in activism. I was never resonant with them, but like the Catholic Worker, the Quakers, you know, things like that. But I was never, you know, like I said, I was never resonant with them, and I don't know how much of an impact they had on movement as a whole, in terms of infusing any kind of spiritual message. I'm sure there was some. I mean, Dr. King, come on, you know, he
Yeah.
was a pastor and very deeply spiritual as well as religious man. But I think, you know, post civil rights and after all the assassinations, you know, and there was so much disillusionment and I would say collective soul loss following those events, I think there was understandably, a lot of bitterness, a lot of depression, a lot of disempowerment of movements, and a lot of reactivity. And so I've been heartened that I would say, in this century, I would say in the last 20 years, 15, I'll say the last 15 years, I have noticed an increase in spiritual orientation. Like if I go to a protest or a demonstration, I'll see more presence, you know, it could, and more diversity in that. So you might see a Buddhist contingents, you know, you might see Hindu contingents, you might see pagan contingents. You know, we have, you know, the whole movement of, I have to think of the word, you know, what Starhawk founded, you know, I feel resonant with what she does, although what I do is different. I feel very deep kinship with her work and her orientation, and have definitely learned things from her works. So I guess I'm saying that I think one of the things that's going more right is that there are more spiritually informed and practicing people in our broader movements for social change. So it's no mistake, in my view, that at least one of the founders of Black Lives Matter is somebody who went through seminary, and that's not real widely known. But if you research the 3 women who founded Black Lives Matter, it's very much in their work. The 1980s was touted in the mainstream media as the me decade, and a time of kind of self-indulgence and turning away from social concerns. And while I'm sure there's some truth in that, I think the greater truth is that a whole lot of people were I don't want to say forced, but there was whatever pressures brought to bear on individuals to face some of their personal material. So there was a huge upsurge, for example, in 12-step groups in the 1980s and 1990s. Every time you turn around, there's a new 12-step group. So whereas it started with Alcoholics Anonymous and some of their kinship groups, children of alcoholics, etc., there became more and more. And the foundation of those groups is really very spiritual. People needing to face where they have power and where they don't, and, finding support outside themselves to get better. And a lot of people entered, either they did it through the 12-step groups, or they commonly added in psychotherapy, did a lot of work on their personal traumas. Because one of the things that we saw play out earlier, and I'm not saying it doesn't still play out, I'm sure it does, but people's various personal traumas and unresolved personal wounds then playing out in the movement. And so I think to the extent that people are much more aware today of their own psychodynamics, of their dynamics with other people, and I'd say that that's kind of infiltrated social awareness. So even people who may not have done psychotherapy may have some awareness of what some of the dynamics are that they need to watch. So I'd say those two things are really positive in terms of what I see in dynamics and movements today. Not that there can't always be more progress. I also think that I was very fortunate back in the 70s that I found organizations on the left that were what they called multi-issue. And what that meant was that we couldn't talk about women's rights without also talking about workers' rights, without also talking about African American rights and gay and lesbian rights. You couldn't just talk about one of them ever in those organizations. And I think that that was very profoundly a base of my own orientation. I think it's very accurate. And now today there's kind of a new wave of that. It's called intersectionality. Mm-hmm. And for me, this is like, yeah, we've always done that back to the 70s, but not everybody has. That's been a split in every social movement between those who want to just take on a single issue, which is always conservatizing, and those who want to include everyone and bring everyone along and lift everyone up. So it certainly happened in the gay movement, gay lesbian movement. There was a split so that the white gay middle-class men, they would only wanted to focus on gay rights. That meant that they didn't deal with lesbians. It meant they didn't deal with gay people of color. They didn't want to deal with people who didn't fit a certain image. They just wanted to deal with the one issue, and that ends up being very conservatizing. So you could see that in any of the mass movements. But anyway, the point is, I think that the mass movements today are much more multi-issue, that it's become more of a principle, and that's a huge step forward.
I would agree. And in listening to you, I keep thinking about the notion that we're not alone, that we're all connected. One thing is connected to another, to another, to another, and you really can't separate any one thing from other things.
Right. Yeah, and there's an old slogan that is being lifted up again now, which is none of us are free till all of us are free. No one can be free till everyone's free. And so in the groups that I was in, I thought one of the really brilliant approaches they took was to focus on the most oppressed people. And they said, if we take care of the most oppressed people, then everyone will be fine. If we address the needs of a lesbian Chicana worker, everyone will be fine, because we'll take care, and especially if she's a mom, we'll take care of childcare, We'll take care of wages, we'll take care of healthcare, we'll take care of racism, we'll take care of misogyny. You know, all these things will be taken care of to meet this person's needs, and then everybody's needs will be met. So I'm a very strong proponent of that. And I see it being borne out today. And I can't say how heartening it is to me, because I think it's the only way that we're going to have really fundamental change.
I'm so glad to hear you reference that and that you feel hopeful. In these days, there's a need for hope, and hope is kind of tough to find. But I'm very glad to hear your evaluation of that. It occurs to me in listening to what you are saying that you are actually talking about shamanic activism. I mean, it's basically kind of a description of that phrase. It's like bringing in all the parts. It's bringing in spirituality. It's bringing in healing. And you referenced collective soul loss a little bit earlier, which I think we're going over again and again and again, and we have been for probably decades. Is that accurate? I mean, is there actually a line between what we were first talking about as activism in a broad sense and shamanic activism, and what's the difference, if any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, the notion that no one's free till everybody's free, you know, or intersectionality or multi-issue politics, however you want to state that it starts to approach the shamanic experience of interconnection of everyone. I think it's a long way from the full shamanic view. I think, but I think it's a good opportunity to shift into that part of our discussion, because I think that probably our biggest, dare I say, or at least one of our biggest challenges culturally, and as we know, US culture dominates the world at this point, so it's not just in this country, it's wherever our tentacles have reached, our media, our wars, whatever, our economy, is this idea of separation, is this paradigm of separation, the idea that I'm separate from you, you know, that Whidbey Island is separate from Austin, that white people are separate from black people, that people are separate from animals, you know, that cities are separate from the countryside, that the Arctic is separate from the tropics, you know, and ultimately that the earth is separate from the cosmos. And so this misunderstanding creates a lot of sequelae that are huge problems. You know, it can create that idea that, oh, well, I can just choose my issue and only worry about that, because I can imagine that I could be okay without you being okay. And it's simply not. It's not the case. And if people can't see anywhere else, surely we can see it with the climate. You know, that if we clear cut the Amazon and destroy the lungs of the earth, there's a consequence. It affects everybody. So I think climate might be one place where people can see it the most clearly, you know, that any action they take, any action any of us takes affects the whole and comes back to us again. I think that's starting to be seen more socially, but I think that huge paradigm of separation continues to haunt us. And I think we're making progress, and there's a lot more to make.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. Is there
you asked me about shamanic activism as distinguished from activism. Did you want me to talk about that?
Yes, please. That was where I was going.
Okay, yeah. So as a shamanic, whatever, you know, with a shamanic view, I not only see all things as interconnected on the physical plane, but also the unseen plane, you know, the plane of non-ordinary reality, or the plane of spirit, however we want to name that. That's also interconnected. And so what we do impacts that world, and that world impacts this world. And so how can we create an understanding and an alliance with our support in the other realms to take forward what needs to happen here?
Oh, I
So
see.
that's one way I would talk about it. So, sourcing spiritual wisdom, sourcing spiritual power, sourcing spiritual perspective to guide our movements, to guide our activism, and most principally to be able to take a stance of humility before what we don't know. It's another huge cultural problem that we face, that we inherited from Europe, is this tremendous hubris, this idea that the earth is here for us to exploit as we wish and do what we want, and that there won't be consequences to that. And the idea that we can control things, the idea that we can know everything, the idea that we even know what needs to happen. So I think that's where it can trip up activists, is when we become so attached to a particular point of view that we can't hear anything outside of it. And then we get stuck and we trip and we fall.
And that might also go for being attached to outcomes.
Exactly. So in my shamanic activism, it's been very much guided by consulting the spirits about, what's my place in a particular situation, how to be of service in that situation, and a certain amount of surrender. Like, I don't know, I don't have the whole picture, and none of us do. None of us humans have the whole picture. So to act as though we do with that kind of hubris, well, we can see what that kind of stance in the world has wrought, created all the problems we have today, in my view.
Very true. I think I appreciate that, because that really crystallizes for me sort of the difference between what I think of as ordinary activism and shamanic activism. It's like the humility is a piece of that we know that we don't know everything, and we know that this energetic sphere, the spirit world that we are working to get more knowledge about, and the relationships that we develop in the non-ordinary world, help us to get a better picture, get some perspective on what's going on that we don't have as humans, as you say. So it's very clear.
Well, I think that to even put a more fine point on it, that there are activists from many different spiritual or religious traditions who might say the same thing. I can imagine some of my Christian allies, taking a stance of humility before God, is how they would think of it, emulating Christ, of the surrender of Christ to God's will. So I don't think that that's in itself shamanic. I think that with shamanic activism, it's about utilizing our particular skill set and our particular sources of power in the other world in doing our activism. I could give an example.
Okay, please do.
So in 2005, a whole lot of things happened, kind of like now, only different. But that was the year of Katrina, which devastated and destroyed a lot of New Orleans. And there's a whole lot of politics surrounding that. There was also the summer, I think it was the summer or the spring, that the Network of Spiritual Progressives had their first founding conference in Berkeley, California. I think that was just prior to Katrina. And then they had another conference in Washington, D.C. the following spring, if I'm remembering the sequence correctly. Or maybe it was the fall. I think they're about 6 months apart, the two founding conferences. In any case, I went to the first one in Berkeley, and I was taken back at how old and white and Abrahamic the whole thing was. It was very heavily Christian, with Jews, with a few Muslims, a few Buddhists, but very heavily Judeo-Christian. And most of the people were probably over 50. And so I quickly helped organize a diversity caucus. And so we pulled together everybody who wasn't a part of what I just described. So it was diversity by race, by sexual orientation, and by spiritual or religious orientation. And so we all pulled together and we organized a number of resolutions and got the whole body to adopt them. Didn't really know where that was going to go, but I was interested. I still had, some hope for this organization and what could be. And so I caught wind that in the Washington, D.C. founding conference, there would be a pray-in in the Lafayette Park, just across from the White House. I think it was probably a pray-in for peace, because this would have been early in the current, what do we want to call it? The current season of war. And so when I heard there was going to be a pray-in, I kind of just put my head in my hands. I was just like, because in my view, I should back up. Well, I guess one thing we didn't say about my background is that I grew up in a very religious household. So my father was a Lutheran pastor and had kind of dreams of me becoming clergy in his tradition. We never really talked about it much, but that was definitely there. But it's like that whole religion didn't take with me. And so one of the things that I feel really distinguishes shamanism from how the Judeo-Christian tradition is typically practiced is that Judeo-Christian prayer is kind of a form of petition. It's like you are petitioning God to intervene and do something or give you something. Whereas in shamanic practice, I see it as working in collaboration with the spirits, gleaning their wisdom that they choose to share with us and drawing on the power they choose to share with us to actually impact things in this world. So it's not just a passive kind of petitioning, it's an active engagement. And so what I wanted was for us to have a peacemaking ritual instead in Lafayette Park. And so I kind of launched this whole campaign among people who I'd met in the diversity caucus. I was like, will you help me lobby the decider of this organization to, in the name of diversity, to make this shift? And I ended up getting the ear of this man's right-hand person, and she was very interested in it. So it was a very long lobbying process that I didn't think was going to ever bear fruit. And then lo and behold, maybe some insane, 3 weeks before the conference, he said, okay. And so then we had to kind of rush to organize this. So what we ended up doing was a peacemaking ritual. And the purpose of the ritual was to heal the history of violence in the name of religion. I thought, if we were trying to bring people together, even within the Abrahamic tradition, there is so much violence in the name of religion, the Crusades. I'm sure there were pogroms done in the name of God, So, and then you don't even talk about, the colonization of India and, the religions there, and not to mention the Americas, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that was a big difference, to have a bunch of people gathered to petition God for peace
Mm-hmm.
versus doing an engaged ritual that we had about 300 people from different traditions engage in with a common intention of, we want to heal the history of violence in the name of religion. And when we told the crowd that's what we wanted to do, everybody they're like, oh my God, yeah, we need to do that. We really need to do that. And so people really engaged with their full heart into that ritual in the park. And it was very powerful. And a number of people told me later that it was their most powerful experience they had in the 4-day conference. So it's a really different practice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's active, and it's there's a taking of responsibility. There's a drawing on powers on the other way. You can say that with prayer. Isn't God a power? Sure, but there's so much to talk about in that. You know, I think I'll just stop there.
Yeah, I understand. It's and it's an excellent example where you can you can say this is this and this is that, and they're related, but they're so different that the shamanic approach of creating ritual versus the prayer approach of petitioning for outside intervention, essentially, is kind of it's, um, it's very well drawn. So thank you for that. Is that when you talked about social healing as well, as opposed to social revolution? I can imagine that some of that is in that story, the social healing aspect of coming together and doing this healing ritual um, would be also an example of what you're talking about in terms of social healing, or is that different?
Yeah, no, you know, definitely healing history is a part of social healing. I do want to say that at this point in my life, uh, I don't see social healing as separate from social revolution.
Hmm.
I think that social healing can create a kind of social revolution. And I think that revolution properly conducted can contribute to social healing. So I wanted to say that.
Okay. And I appreciate that. That helps to tie together those two things that at first glance would be separate, but they're not.
Yeah, I mean, I think a revolution is kind of a reordering of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that could happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, you know, the whole Bernie Sanders movement, they talked about political revolution, you know, they wanted to reorder the priorities in this country, right, through electoral means. And so there's a lot. So, but I think a revolution is kind of a reordering of things. And so if we reorder things in such a way that we understand and honor in an active way the interconnection of all things, that's a kind of revolution. That's a reordering of things.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can heal the dire history of white supremacy in this country, you know, for all players, I mean, nobody goes unscathed from white supremacy, including white people. People who are raised white in this society are not unscathed. They may have certain benefits that the culture, the economy doles out to people, but it's not free. You know, it's like when one engages in perpetrating, in my view, perpetrating white supremacy, you know, misogyny, patriarchy, these kinds of things, environmental exploitation, you know, rape of the earth, we don't go unscathed from those things. We don't go unscathed from them spiritually. And as we know from our earlier discussion, it all comes back home. You know, it all ends up coming back home. And so, so social, if we were able to heal, you know, the history of wounding in the name of white supremacy in this country, surely that would bring about a reordering
Mm-hmm.
of things, and hence revolution, in my definition.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. It's well put. You know, and changing subjects a little bit, or maybe a lot, I'm not sure. When we spoke last time, prior to deciding to do this podcast, you told me a story that's still hanging in there with me. It had to do with BLM in Portland and people showing up to either help or get in the way. And there was a group that was there that I don't know if they took over the bullhorn or not, but and this is from memory, so maybe you can help me straighten this one out. But the Black Lives Matter leadership sort of went to them and said, "Wait a minute, what are you doing?" And that particular sort of subgroup was able to hear that and back up and say, "You're right." And then from that point forward, they began to work together in concert toward the common goal that they were both trying to do. So those are the pieces of this particular story that I remember. Do you still have a hook to that?
I don't remember specifically about a bullhorn. I know that
was my addition, I'm sure.
No, no. I mean, maybe there is a story about that. Or maybe it's figurative bullhorn. You know? But I mean, there's a dynamic when we are working around questions of oppression of a demographic, where the group that's oppressed needs to have the leadership of the movement. It's really crucial, because those of us who are not in that group are not going to have the consciousness and awareness, and often are trained on the contrary to participate in the oppression. So if we're talking about the oppression of Blacks or African Americans in this country, then those of us who are not African American, especially those of us who are raised white, are going to be socialized, to dominate and to take the mic, to be the leaders, even to be the saviors. It's a whole white savior complex in our culture.
Sure.
And so, there are just programming in us for that. And so I think that this is not limited to Portland. It's a dynamic that can happen anywhere.
Sure.
And not only with this particular demographic, but it's a good one since it's so in the spotlight right now. And so so again, in a way, it's what we're talking about. It can come back to the question of humility and hubris too, right? Because that's an essential element of those dominator socializations is hubris. Well, I must know better. I must know better than you. And it's not even thought as a thought. It's just an assumption. It's just a way of being with any one down, one up, one down situation. So it may be that you're more educated through schools, right? And so then there's an assumption that, well, I can speak better or I can think better, which isn't necessarily the case at all. Or again, if I'm white and you're Black, or if I'm male and you're female, it's just in us. We just have to accept that it's just in us. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the story you recounted, was that I'm going to guess it was white people who took the mic and started doing whatever, and that the Black leadership was like, wait a minute, this is our movement. What are you doing? And that the white people were able to go, oh, whoops, and step back and get it. So again, that's a point of some progress in movements, I would say. Very hard one. I certainly have witnessed that in the women's movement. Probably everybody's heard that, well, probably not everybody, but there's this term mansplaining, right? Where a woman is recounting something, and then a man starts explaining to her what she's saying, and she's actually the one who came up with the idea and made the analysis, and he may even be misinterpreting it wrongly, but thinking he's the authority on it. it's just the same thing. It's just the way people are socialized. I think it's important to not have a lot of angst about these things. It's so easy to go into angst, like, oh my God, I did something racist, I did something sexist, I did something homophobic. It's like, yeah, we do that. It's just what we do. And the more we can just go, okay, well, I did that. Okay, let me clean that up and back off from that and do it different next time, that's the best thing, that we can do. And so I do remember that in Portland, this might be what you were thinking of, that there was as the police were doing a lot of violence towards the protesters, one day a bunch of moms organized and went downtown, and they made what they called the Wall of Moms. So they made a wall of moms around the protesters and to protect them, thinking that the police would not aggress to a wall of moms, which we found out was not the case. But anyway, I heard, this is hearsay, I don't have any direct contacts in this, but I heard that there was that dynamic, that there was a concern about, well, who were the leadership of the Wall of Moms and who were they accountable to? And as soon as what I heard was that as soon as those presumably predominantly white women heard that, they said, oh, well, let's have the Black moms be the leaders. And that was it, So yeah, instead of having a struggle about it and saying, well, why can't we lead? We support you and blah, 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 we're not there yet. Maybe one day it'll be that way. But right now it's so crucial to be able to step back, and have that humility that we're not, whatever our unconscious idea is, that because we're more educated or because we have more money or because we're in the dominant race or sex, that somehow we know better, the more we can step back from that, the much more we're going to understand and experience the interconnection of everybody and have the kind of solidarity to really make huge changes.
Yeah, it's about finding your proper place in the scheme of things, or how things are flowing.
Yeah, and I think also it's part of our culture is like we are socialized to really be very attached to our own individual egoic position, and it's a place where shamanism can help. If we can have our spiritual experiences with the compassionate spirits, and through their assistance and our experiences with them, have a proper perspective of who we are in the cosmos, just a little tiny speck, in all that is, and that we really don't know very much, and a lot of what we think we know probably isn't accurate even.
Yeah,
and it becomes easier for us to also have humility with other humans, I think. I would hope, that, oh, like maybe I also don't know everything in this reality.
Yeah, I think part of what's running in my head is the idea of not just humility, but self-reflection and becoming more aware of my personal programming, my personal dynamics. And I'm remembering a time in some place in several years ago when it struck me that there's this racist that lives in here, and I had no idea. All I knew was certain things were happening, and I started to think, wait a minute, I need to look at that. And so the healing part was to be, number one, aware that it was there, and number two is to stalk it, so that whenever it would show up, I could say, there it is. But I don't have to beat myself up. I just have to say, there it is. And then I can work around it. But there's a lot of self-reflection and introspection and flexibility that we need to have in order to find our proper place in things.
That's right. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I've been part of a interracial dialogue group on race for about 15 years in Portland. And I don't live there anymore, but now I get to do it by Zoom, now that everything's by Zoom. But anyway, there's a longtime member in that group he's such my role model with this, because he is a Black gay man who happens to also be paraplegic. And even though our conversations are focused on race in that group, of course, other things come up. And occasionally he talks about his sexism.
Mm.
He just, yeah, I noticed this and that the other day. I had this thought, or I did this thing, and then I saw it and I went, huh, damn it.
Mm.
But he seems, from as far as I can see, there doesn't seem to be all this tremendous angst about it. He's not
Mm.
happy about it. He's certainly not proud of it, but he's able to identify it, and criticize it and make a note of it, make a correction in the wide world, with the other people, and, try to eat away at that socialization as a man, that he has a particular place, or particular status or quality or whatever. So I think, around race, I would love to achieve that. I don't feel that I have,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to just go, oh, I did that thing, and to not get all in a spin about it. I'm getting better, but I think he's really my role model for that.
I think that's a great story, and that's not been my experience as well. I gave up to a large extent, beating myself up over things that I am noticing that are not perfect in me. But nonetheless, every once in a while it pops up its ugly head, and I, have to figure out what to do with that. But my experience so far is just awareness in and of itself is a healing and transforming kind of activity, if you could call it activity. So
Yeah, I think there's both an internal and external component.
yes.
There's, maybe we identify it ourselves, or maybe somebody points it out to us, and then being able to reflect on it and come to understanding of it, analysis, do some internal work around trying to shift it or dissolve it. And then there's probably also some external work, like, who did we hurt with that? What do we need to say to them? What do we need to do to make things right? And as long as I'm on that,
Great.
I want to give a plug for how to make a proper apology, because I think culturally, the way we are, most of us anyway, most of us are raised up that an apology is saying, I'm sorry. And that's kind of the end of it. And it's just really not. Talk's cheap,
Mm-hmm.
It may take a little bit of humility to say, I'm sorry, but often it's just, I'm sorry, and then on to something else, without ever really attending to what happened, or how it felt, or what the impact was, or, what have we left in our wake. And so I think it's really essential that we come to a place where, when we realize that we've done something that's wounded, or that our ancestors wounded,
Mm-hmm.
that things need to be put right. It's not just words. It's like, what is the amends? That's something else that was in the 12-step movement, by the way, that may be helping right now. People were taught to make an inventory of all their wrongs and where it was possible to make amends. And so I think there is a greater willingness today. I'm speaking in very general, broad terms, but that there's a more of an awareness about the necessity to not just say I'm sorry, but to actually do something. Like, how can I make it right?
Great, thank you. And that's very true as well. And we need to clean up our messes.
Yeah.
Lenore, I've kind of come to the end of my list of questions right now. So is there anything that you particularly would like to say before we kind of wrap this up?
Well, I'd like to talk about what I see as some of the different levels of shamanic activism.
Great.
Because I think that there are, can we take a little break for a second? Because I actually have some notes about this that would be helpful if I bring them up.
Sure.
So as you know, Gerry, I'm working on a book on shamanic activism, and one of the things I discuss in the book is different levels of shamanic activism. So I just like to leave people today, especially those who already are practicing shamanism, some of the possible ways that shamanism can be applied to activism and social healing. So one is to gain one's own personal empowerment and healing, and to be able to bring that vibration and perspective into the world. Another is to gain spiritual perspective on building a balanced relationship with the world, including the natural world, the human world, our social situation, our political world, and just bringing a spiritual perspective into building those balanced relationships, I see as a kind of shamanic activism. Also, gaining spiritual perspective on specifically the socio-political situation in order to help mend that web. Also, if one is an activist, then to gain spiritual guidance on your activism from the spirits, and including in that, learning to focus on an intention for the highest good and surrendering the outcome of the activism. So that's a really different orientation than your kind of garden variety activism, where it's really trying to get a specific thing done. And if that specific thing doesn't happen, then you failed and you need to press on and make it happen. So in a shamanic perspective, there would be more surrender in that. Another is to work in your shamanic community with your shamanic peers on behalf of the world. So in a shamanic circle, gaining perspective together and gaining direction together, and even performing rituals within that space on behalf of the highest good. Also, you can be in service to fellow activists, doing divination or healing work on their behalf, if they want it, of course. Providing perspective to the movement and surprising but effective strategies that you get from your spirit allies. I think another one is developing an interfaith spiritual activism. That's something we haven't talked about today that I've worked with quite a lot. I mean, I did mention it about the ritual in Lafayette Park, but that's kind of an ongoing practice of being able to develop relationships with people from other spiritual or religious approaches and find common ground for interfaith work. And then there are performing public rituals like I described today. And also, lastly, bringing spiritual power to bear in ordinary reality. All of that, of course, has to be done with a lot of humility and surrender, and not trying to control things or intervene where intervention isn't appropriate, or there's not permission, or it's not welcome. So those are some of the different levels I think of when I think of shamanic activism.
Very good. That's an excellent list, Lenore. I appreciate that very much. Are there other resources that you would suggest that people look into, or some place to go or read or see, or those sorts of things?
You know, I have several articles and interviews on my website about shamanic activism from over the years. So my website is lenoirnorgard.com. There's a link for publications, and you'll see several things there. So I recommend Starhawk. You know, she calls herself a witch and works in a pagan tradition, but she does work with ritual. And I like her work. She's got several books. I don't have a book yet. I'm working on it. I do occasionally teach shamanism for activism trainings. And if people are interested in that, please contact me, because it's something I'm very interested to do sooner than later.
Okay. And you can find all of those references to that on your website, or do you have should they get on your email list, or?
Yeah, if you're interested in shamanic activism or doing any study or work with me, I'd certainly welcome you to subscribe to my email newsletter. I usually just put newsletters out when there's an offering, or, you know, when offerings are coming up. So I just want you to know, I don't like email every day. You won't get overwhelmed with email from my newsletter, but you will be notified about opportunities coming up.
Okay, very good. Well, I greatly appreciate your time this afternoon. And I want to be sensitive to the situation that you're in at the moment with the fires going on and all sorts of things happening around you. So I'm very appreciative that you took some time to visit with me. And perhaps we'll get together and do this again some other time.
Thanks, Gerry. I really appreciate your interest in this, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing in the world.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.